Wyoming Territory, June 1883. The wind blew low and hot across the prairie when Micah Adler spotted the wagon by the cottonwoods. Its wheel cracked clean through and the canvas peeled back like a torn dress. He pulled his horse to a stop and narrowed his eyes against the sun. Something was wrong. He stepped down, boots crunching dry grass, hand resting on the butt of his Colt more out of habit than fear. "Hello?" he called out. No answer. He moved closer. That was when he saw her, a woman sitting in the dirt beside the broken wagon. Fingers dug into the earth. Her dress torn at the hem and dust streaked across her cheek. Her head was bowed, brown hair tangled and caught in a ribbon that had long since lost its color. "You hurt?" Micah asked, voice low and steady. She looked up slowly, eyes glassy but sharp. "No," she said. "Just left." Micah crouched down, close enough to see that her hands were trembling. "Left?" She nodded, lips pressed tight. "My husband," she said. "He drove off yesterday morning. Said I was no use to him. Left me here with nothing but a broken wheel." Micah's jaw tightened. "You got a name?" "Grace," she said. "Grace Fletcher." "You got folks nearby?" "No," her voice caught. "No one." He looked at her, really looked. She was not just worn down. She was broken in places a man could not see. But she was still sitting upright, still breathing, still looking him in the eye. That counted for something. He helped her to her feet. "My name's Micah Adler. I got a ranch about half a day from here. You can stay there till you figure things out." Grace hesitated. "Why would you do that?" Micah tilted his hat back. "Because decent folks do not leave someone to die under the sun." She followed him without another word. The ride back was quiet. Grace clutched the saddle horn like it was the last solid thing in the world. Micah rode steady, not asking questions. The ranch sat in a wide valley backed by pine-covered hills. The house was plain but strong, the barn neat, the yard swept. A windmill creaked in the breeze. Micah helped her down. "You hungry?" She nodded. He set her at the kitchen table and fixed bread, beans, and coffee. She ate slow, careful, like she was not used to being fed. Micah watched without saying much. When she finished, she wiped her mouth and looked at him. "I'm not going back," she said. "I did not figure you were." "I cannot have children," she said, words clipped. "That is why he left me. Thought he was getting a wife to give him sons. Got a dried-up woman instead." Micah leaned back in his chair. "Well, I ain't looking for sons. I am looking for someone who knows how to fight through hell and still say thank you for a hot meal." Grace blinked. "You do not even know me. You are still sitting upright," he said. "That is enough for now." That night he gave her the spare room. She stood in the doorway, fingers curled around the doorframe. "I can work," she said. "I will not be a burden." Micah looked at her. "You take 2 days to rest. After that, we will see." She nodded once, then stepped inside and shut the door. Over the next week, Grace moved through the house like a shadow at first, quiet and careful. But each day something shifted. She swept, chopped vegetables, learned the rhythm of the place. She started brushing her hair again. She laughed, once a short, surprised sound that made Micah pause mid-step in the barn. One morning he found her outside before sunrise, wearing one of his old flannel shirts and holding a hoe. "I can tend the garden," she said. He handed her gloves. "Then let us get to it." They worked side by side, sweat rolling down their necks, not needing to fill the silence. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived from Grace's husband. Micah found it in the mailbox, the envelope torn and the handwriting rushed. Grace read it once, then dropped it into the stove without a word. The fire ate the paper in seconds. Micah waited. "He wants to take me back," she said finally. "Said he was angry and made a mistake. Said he forgives me." Micah's mouth tightened. Forgives you? She nodded, eyes hard. Like I did something wrong. You going? She shook her head. No. Micah looked at her long and steady. Good. That night, as the wind picked up across the hills, Grace stepped out onto the porch where Micah was sitting. I do not know what this is, she said, arms crossed. But I sleep better here. He looked up at her. Good. I feel worth something here. You are. She sat next to him. Close. Not touching. Just close. Micah, she said softly. I do not know if I can give anyone a future. He turned to her then. You are not giving me a future, Grace. You are the future. Her eyes filled, and she looked away, brushing her cheek with the back of her hand. He reached over and took her hand. She let him. They sat like that until the stars came out, her head resting lightly on his shoulder, their fingers laced together. Neither said another word, but something had changed, and neither of them would ever be the same. By early July, the creek behind the barn had shrunk to a ribbon, but the cottonwoods kept their shade, and that's where Grace liked to sit after chores. She'd taken to mending clothes in the afternoons, her needle steady, the basket at her feet full of shirts worn through at the elbows and socks too stubborn to throw away. Micah let her be, only joining her when the sun fell low enough to silver the tops of the hills. That evening he carried 2 mugs of coffee, passed one to her without speaking, and settled on the overturned bucket nearby. She didn't look up from her stitching. How old were you when you left home? She asked, threading the needle again. 17, he said. After my pa died, I took work where I could find it. Rail lines, cattle drives, fence posts. Didn't see the inside of a house for 3 years. Grace nodded, tying off a seam. I left at 19. Married the first man who said he'd take me west. Micah shifted, resting his forearms on his knees. You miss anything back east? The smell of rain on stone, she said, and a bell tower near the bakery. It rang every hour. I used to count the chimes lying in bed. He let that settle between them. The breeze stirred her skirt against her ankles, and the sky turned the color of ripe plums. She looked over then. You ever think about marrying? His gaze stayed on the creek. Thought about it, he said. But I figured I was the kind of man who got left behind. Grace blinked. You think that now? No, he said, finally meeting her eyes. Not since you sat down on my porch and didn't run. She smiled without showing teeth, and her fingers stilled on the fabric. I never learned how to run far enough. You don't have to, Micah said. Not anymore. The next morning, Grace rose before the rooster. She stood at the wash basin and braided her hair tighter than usual, then pulled on the blue skirt Micah's late sister had left behind in a trunk. It fit well enough after Grace took in the waist. She found him in the pasture, watching a young sorrel test the fence line. I want to help with the bookkeeping, she said, hands clasped behind her back. Micah didn't turn. Ain't much to it. I know how to tally. I can read ledgers. My father kept the accounts for the tannery. He looked at her then, eyes narrowed against the sun. You sure you want to dig through dusty papers when the garden needs weeding? I need to use my mind, she said. Hands alone don't quiet it. He nodded once. I'll show you after supper. Grace spent the hours until evening scrubbing the windows with vinegar and old cloths, as if clearing the glass might help her see her place in this life more clearly. By the time Micah laid the ledger on the table, her hair was damp against her neck. She bent over the columns while he watched from the doorway, thumb hooked through his belt loop. You keep your numbers clean, she said after a while. But you've been underpaid for 3 of the hay deliveries. Micah stepped forward. How do you figure? She pointed, not touching the page. You marked 30 bales, but if you follow the line across, the amount paid matches 27. Happened in June and again last week. Micah leaned in, brows drawing together. You're right. Grace looked up. Want me to write the merchant in town? He nodded, slow. I do. She dipped the pen and began. Later, as Micah cleaned out the lanterns, he didn't speak, but his movements were more careful, like the weight in his chest had shifted slightly. By the week's end, Grace had reorganized the pantry, repaired a saddlebag, and taught herself to cut the kindling straighter. She didn't ask for praise, and Micah didn't offer any, but the way he left an extra biscuit on her plate each morning said enough. One evening, as the crickets started up and the sky turned to ash, Grace stood at the edge of the porch, arms folded. Micah came up behind her. You thinking of the road again? She didn't look at him. No. I was wondering if it's all right to feel steady. He stepped beside her, leaving a few inches of space. It's more than all right. Grace tilted her head. I was always told women like me needed to earn their place twice over. You already have, he said. She turned to him then, eyes searching. And if I never change? If I stay quiet and stubborn and full of old scars? Micah's voice was low. Then I'll be damn lucky. She reached for his hand, and this time he didn't wait. Fingers met and held. No trembling, no doubt. And though neither of them said the word aloud, it settled there between them anyway, something whole and quiet and true, growing like roots under the soil. By mid-July, the heat settled over the land like a wet blanket. Grasshoppers rattled through the tall rye, and thunderheads gathered most afternoons without ever breaking. Inside the house, the air was close and still, so Grace took to doing her sewing under the cottonwood in the back pasture, where the breeze stirred enough to breathe easy. One morning, Micah rode in from checking the far fence line, his shirt damp at the collar and dust clinging to his boots. Grace looked up from the hem she'd been working and shaded her eyes. You're limping, she said. Horse stepped in a gopher hole, he muttered, sliding down from the saddle. Twisted my knee, not bad. She rose and crossed to him, steady and sure. Sit down. Let me see. He started to wave her off, but she didn't give him the chance. She took his arm and guided him to the stump near the fence line. He lowered himself with a grunt. Grace knelt and rolled up his pant leg. The joint was swollen, the skin hot. She pressed carefully around the bone. You've done this before, he said, watching her. My grandfather was a cooper. He took more than a few falls. I used to wrap his joints when they stiffened. Micah studied her. You ever think about being a healer? She shrugged, reaching for a strip of cloth from her basket. Not much call for one who can't read Latin or afford books. But I know how to keep a man walking. He chuckled low in his throat. That you do. She bound the knee firm, her fingers quick and confident. When she was finished, she sat back on her heels and looked up. You'll need to stay off it tomorrow. Hard to do with 100 acres needing tending. I'll take the east field, she offered. Just tell me what to look for. He hesitated only a moment. You sure? I wouldn't offer if I weren't. The next day, she rose before dawn and packed a tin of bread, cheese, and a flask of water. Micah handed her the reins to his gentlest mare and pointed out where he'd seen bent posts and torn wire. Watch for rattlers, he said, and don't cross the creek. Bank's soft this time of year. She nodded and mounted up, skirt gathered neatly over the saddle. As she rode out, she glanced back once, just long enough to meet his gaze. He raised his hand in a slow wave. She tipped her chin in return. The field was wide and golden, the air alive with insects. Grace worked steady, hammering fence staples, tightening wire with calloused fingers that no longer blistered. The sun climbed, but she didn't slow. When she paused to drink, she sat in the shade of a cottonwood and watched a red-tailed hawk circle high above. That night, she returned with sunburned cheeks and a fresh tear in her skirt, but a quiet satisfaction in her eyes. She found Micah in the barn, brushing down the mare. "You did good," he said. "So did she," Grace replied, resting a hand on the horse's flank. "I think she likes me." Micah turned, brushing hay from his sleeves. "You're easy to like." She didn't answer, but her smile lingered longer than usual. Later, as they shelled beans on the porch, the lantern between them casting long shadows, Grace spoke without lifting her gaze. "I was betrothed once before I married." Micah waited. He was a schoolteacher. Pale, thoughtful, always nervous about his glasses. Said he wanted to marry me because I was quiet. Said I made the world seem less loud. "What happened?" Micah asked. "He died of fever the spring we were to wed." "I still have the letter he wrote before the end. Told me not to live small out of grief." Micah nodded slowly. "You haven't." "I did for a while," she said. "But not here." He reached for her hand then, not sudden, just sure. She let her fingers rest in his, rough skin against rough skin, and turned toward him. "What kind of man were you before all this?" she asked. "Angry," he said. "Didn't trust much. Took work that kept me moving. And now," he didn't speak for a beat. "Then, now I find myself standing still." Grace leaned slightly closer. "That scare you?" "No," he said. "It feels like something I didn't know I needed." Her eyes softened, and she drew her thumb in a slow arc over the back of his hand. "I never thought I'd feel safe again." "You are," he said, voice low. "With me, you are." They sat that way as the crickets hummed and the land cooled around them. No declarations, only the weight of quiet understanding. And when Grace rose to go inside, she didn't let go of his hand until they reached the door together. The first rain in weeks came slow and steady, pattering over the roof as dusk settled. Grace stood by the open window, her fingers resting on the sill, eyes tracing the droplets as they carved paths down the glass. Inside, the scent of damp earth mixed with the faint tang of iron from the stove. Behind her, Micah laid a clean cloth over the kitchen table. "I found a parcel in town," he said, setting a wrapped bundle beside her sewing basket. "Traded 2 hides for it." Grace turned, brows lifting. She approached, hesitating before peeling back the brown paper. Inside was a length of calico deep green with tiny cream-colored flowers scattered through it and a small tin of buttons carved from bone. Her throat tightened. "You didn't have to." "I know," he said, "but I thought maybe you'd want something that's yours alone." She smoothed a corner of the fabric. "It's beautiful." Micah leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "I figured you could make something for Sunday." Grace looked up. "You go to services?" "Not often, but there's a gathering at the schoolhouse this week. Folks bring food, play music after the sermon. Figured we might go." She folded the cloth carefully. "I haven't stood in front of a crowd since I left Illinois. You won't be standing alone." The rain shifted, heavier now, drumming the roof with quiet insistence. Grace held the tin of buttons in her palm, drawing her thumb across the lid. "You ever feel watched, even when you ain't?" she asked softly. Micah didn't move. "Only when I'm remembering things that never finished proper." She met his eyes. "I used to walk with my head down. Thought if I took up less space, I'd be easier to keep." "You take all the space you need here," he said. She didn't answer right away. Then, in a voice just above a whisper, "I'm starting to believe that." The next morning, Grace measured and marked the calico, her scissors moving with quiet confidence. She worked by the light of the window, the rain gone but the clouds still low. Micah repaired a tack strap nearby, occasionally glancing over. She caught him once and didn't look away. "You ever think about what kind of father you'd be?" she asked, pinning a fold. He paused, setting the awl down. "Sometimes. Not often." Why not? He rubbed his jaw. Didn't see much good come from fathers when I was young. Always figured if I made it through without turning bitter, that'd be enough. Grace stitched a seam slow and even. You're not bitter. He shrugged. Took me a while to learn stillness, and longer to trust it. She nodded, her expression unreadable. I think you'd be fair. Quiet, but the kind that listens. Micah leaned back in his chair. And you? I'd have made a good mother. Neither of them filled the silence that followed. It hung between them, not sharp, just heavy with truths neither had spoken aloud before. 3 days later, the sky cleared, and the ground dried enough for wagons to pass without sinking. On Sunday morning, Grace stepped out of the house wearing the green dress she'd sewn. Her boots polished, hair braided and pinned in a crown across the top of her head. Micah stood by the wagon, adjusting the reins on the team. When he turned and saw her, his hands paused mid-motion. You look steady as spring, he said. Her cheeks colored. I feel like myself again. They rode into town, the schoolhouse already bustling with families. Laughter spilled from the yard where children chased one another, and the scent of fresh bread mingled with wood smoke. Grace stayed close to Micah's side as folks greeted him with nods and gentle smiles. Inside, they found a bench near the back. Grace folded her hands in her lap, her shoulders straight. When the hymn started, she sang in a voice clear and sure, though quiet. Micah didn't sing, but he watched her with a kind of still reverence. After the sermon, they drifted outside. A fiddler struck up a tune, and couples began to pair off. Grace stood near the edge, watching, her fingers brushing the fabric of her skirt. Micah came to her side. You want to dance? She hesitated. I haven't since I was a girl. I'll follow your lead. She smiled, just a faint curve of her lips, and placed her hand in his. They moved in a slow circle on the packed dirt, his hand firm at her back, hers resting on his shoulder. The music was simple, the steps familiar. Around them, the world felt wider than it had in years, but between them, there was only closeness. As the song ended, Micah leaned in, his forehead touching hers. You belong here, Grace. She closed her eyes. I know. They didn't speak on the ride home, but it wasn't silence born of distance. It was the kind that grows when two people have said what matters without needing more words. At the ranch, as twilight bled into night, Grace stood by the fence and looked out over the land. Micah joined her, his hand resting lightly at her waist. I never thought I'd have peace, she said. You made it, he replied. You built it here. She turned to him, eyes steady. With you. And in that moment, surrounded by the quiet hum of crickets and the slow breath of the hills, something long buried settled into place, solid, lasting, and wholly theirs. The days softened as July eased toward August, the light in the evenings stretching long across the ridges. Grass turned brittle at the edges, but the garden held on, heavy with beans and the first yellow squash. Grace rose early each morning and worked until the sun crested the far pine line, then returned inside to cool her skin at the wash basin and pour buttermilk into a cracked ceramic cup. One afternoon, Micah came in with dust along his collar and a worn leather pouch in his hand. He laid it on the table without a word. Grace looked up from the preserves she was sealing. What's that? He pulled out a folded paper, careful at the creases. Deed to the North Plot. Had it surveyed last year but never signed it over. Figured I didn't need more land than I could work. Grace wiped her hands on her apron. And now, Micah met her gaze. It's yours if you want it. Not as a favor. As a start. She glanced at the paper, then back at him. You're giving me land? I'm giving you a choice, he said. To plant what you want, build what you want, shape it how you see fit. Grace stood still, fingers curled slightly at her sides. Why? Micah's voice held quiet certainty. Because I want to build a life with you, not just fold you into mine. Her breath caught, but she didn't cry. She walked to the table, picked up the deed, and ran her thumb along the edge. I'd plant lavender, she said softly, and maybe a cherry tree near the fence line. You'll have what you need, he said. We'll fence it together. 2 days later, they walked the boundary, wire spools slung over their shoulders. The sun climbed high, but they worked in tandem, their movements matched without discussion. At dusk, Grace stood at the top of the slope, looking out over the staked markers and bare earth. It's not much to look at now, she said. Micah brushed a bit of bark from his sleeve. Neither was this place when I bought it. A house don't mean anything until someone lives in it. She turned to him. And a field don't mean anything until something grows. He stepped closer. You've grown something here, Grace. With your hands, yes. But more than that, with your steadiness, your way of seeing things clear. Her voice was low. I never thought I'd be wanted for that. Micah reached out, resting his hand against her cheek, thumb rough against her temple. You're not just wanted. You're known. She leaned into the touch, eyes closed for a breath. Then, without hesitation, she kissed him. It wasn't rushed or unsure. It was the kind of kiss that settled deep and certain, like rain after a long stretch of dry. When they pulled apart, Grace didn't move back. When I first saw you, she said, I thought you looked like the kind of man who'd never ask more than someone could give. I won't, he said. But if you offer it, I'll hold it careful. She nodded once, then smiled. Then you'd better hold on. They were married in the small white chapel at the eastern edge of the valley, with the preacher's wife humming a hymn under her breath and a few neighbors gathered with fresh-cut flowers and hand pies. Grace wore the green calico dress, restitched at the waist, and Micah stood with his boots polished and his hair combed flat. They didn't speak during the ceremony beyond what was asked, but when it was done, Grace laced her fingers with his and didn't let go. They returned to the ranch that afternoon, where Grace had set a simple table beneath the cottonwoods. A berry pie cooled on the windowsill. The windmill turned slow in the breeze, and the chickens scratched contentedly in the straw. That night, they lay in the quiet of the house, the windows open to the sound of crickets and the creak of the porch boards cooling. Micah traced a line along her shoulder with the edge of his hand. You afraid? He asked. No, she said. Not of this. He kissed her again, slower now, and they folded into each other with the kind of trust that doesn't need to be spoken. They didn't build a new house. Instead, they added a room off the east wall, where the morning light came in soft and golden. Grace planted lavender just beyond the porch and a cherry sapling near the fence where the soil was richest. By the next spring, the land had changed. The garden doubled in size. A hen hatched a full clutch, and the barn saw a second stall added. They worked side by side, some days speaking little, other days with laughter rising up between chores. Grace began keeping a ledger of their days, not for accounts but for memory. She wrote of the scent of Micah's shirt after he'd been in the hayloft, of the way he always left the window cracked even in winter so she could hear the wind. She wrote of the first bloom on the cherry tree, and how it reminded her of the hope she had once buried deep. One evening, as they sat on the porch with their knees touching, Micah reached into his pocket and pulled out a small square of folded paper. I wrote this the day I found you, he said. Grace took it gently, unfolded it. Inside, in Micah's careful hand, were just 4 words. She's not leaving again. She looked up, eyes wet. You were right, she said. He leaned in, pressing his lips to her temple. I was just hoping. Years passed, but the hope never faded, and Grace never left.